Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh, and joining me today is Russ
Hello.
and Bracey.
That's me.
All right, that's a choice. Um, Today we're going to be having a long overdue conversation about Light and Magic, the Disney Plus documentary series directed by Lawrence Kasdan, the writer of many Star Wars films and Raiders of the Lost Ark, as well as the director of such classics as The Big Chill and Body Heat. And I thought he was a really interesting choice to tell this story. Light and Magic is, of course, about the famed special effects company Industrial Light and Magic that was founded to do the special effects for Star Wars, and to this day is sort of the gold standard of visual effects in movies and has created the most groundbreaking technical innovations. Bracey, what were your overall thoughts about Light and Magic after you watched it?
Well, I was really happy to watch the first episode with my girls, and after that, I became extremely um, uh, selfish and decided to watch it all myself because they were taking too long to come to the table because I was just loving it. It reminded me of all the things that got me excited about filmmaking, got me excited about creating with friends. It reminded me of what I loved about just like solving problems, and that like as much as there might be an established way to do something, that doesn't mean that it's the best way to do something. And I just saw a lot of threads being tied to my life in a way that I had kind of forgotten, and it felt great. It felt like visiting old friends that I didn't even know I had. um, uh, and also just amazing to see what what was happening behind the scenes, getting a clearer understanding of of just how everything grew to become what we know today as Industrial Light and Magic.
No, totally. What was the name of one of the episodes? I think it was like the third or fourth one. It was like I found my people or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was
Um,
good. It felt home.
Russ, what were your overall thoughts after watching Light and Magic?
I feel like it was the behind the scenes I'd always wanted to see. Kind of from the mouths of the people that were involved. And I think one of my key takeaways, and like I kind of look at the first episode for me as like, I mean, probably my favorite because it's the most Star Wars centric and kind of part two kind of finishes that arc. Um, but it just the idea that a lot of these people were skilled craftsmen that weren't necessarily movie people and kind of brought into the mix. And you kind of have this kind of jack of all trades, and there's a camaraderie and this kind of like fellowship of creators there, and it just felt like a space I think the three of us have shared, at times, and I just it felt like kind of like watching like being home in a way, and like that creative home space. And it just it sucked me in. It was everything I'd ever wanted to see because it's everything that I love also about movie making. It's a lot of it's that tactility, that creation, that like let's just try it. I think it was John Dykstra who has one line in that first episode. And he's like, it's one nonstop continuous test. And I was like, that is special effects. That's movie making. It's just, yeah, it just happens to be the shot we got. The next one will be better, different, who knows? But it's all an experiment, and that's kind of exciting, and that's what I really got out of that this series, starting with that first episode.
No,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, everything you guys said, but you just reminded me of something Dennis Muren said in, I guess, like somewhere midway toward the second half of the series, where he had this kind of revelation or realization about the advantage CG had over practical effects. There's not the advantage, but just like the mindset, but like the idea that you can keep refining it. Like the shot never goes anywhere. You keep like tweaking it, and improving it and improving it and improving it. Whereas, like in the old days, you tried a shot and you got it developed and you watched it and it wasn't exactly what you wanted. So then you do another take and you adjust the movements and you do this and that. And then it's that sort of like trial and error experimentation. And that was something that I had never really conceived of. But anyway, yeah, this show really floored me. Like I had an unexpectedly quite emotional reaction, I think, for all the reasons you guys are saying. Bracey, when you're like, I felt like I was like seeing friends I didn't know that I had, and Russ, you saying that you felt that sort of home of that sort of creative space. I mean, yeah, like e- like even though we've never met these people, I feel like I understand when they're talking about the process that they're going through, that process of discovery, experimentation, problem solving, and fun and creativity, and just like joy about what it is that they're doing. Like, I feel like that's something that we, certainly the three of us, that's something, I know what they're talking about, even if I don't share the specific experience that they're talking about.
Also, all while losing your mind, like all while like just completely going ape
S-
shit,
Sleep
Yeah.
crazy,
deprived
like
and
sleep deprived, not
Under
stressed.
pressure, like
remembering
nothing
things.
matters. I don't know. Is it
Yeah,
day outside or night? I don't know. Is it AM or
yeah,
PM? I don't know. No, no, totally. And then, yeah, the other thing, like, just to narrow it through a Star Wars lens for a second, like, you think you've read all the stuff and seen all the stuff that there is, but there was something about hearing these stories from the mouths of the people who were actually there, and not only just hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but then like the footage that I would I I bet money that some of these film reels hadn't been cracked open since 1977, like the Lucasfilm archives of like ILM footage from the making of the original Star Wars. So the combination of hearing it from the people who did it, seeing these visuals that I didn't know existed, weaving it all together as like one narrative, like I'd never really, I don't know, like I was unprepared for how overwhelming that would feel.
yeah. And it was as overwhelming as it might have felt for you. I can only imagine what it felt like for the people who were a part of that crew, getting to see like I teared up finding some old footage of like us shooting a music video in college. Like so,
Yeah.
like seeing all of us and some kind of Polaroids and stuff like that. I was like, oh man, all hitting the feels. But these people, uh, the wave that they rode after creating something like that, being a part of something like that, seeing how something like that is like changed the way the world sees the universe to some extent. And like being like, coming to terms with being a part of that and then it going away and not, and for some of them, many of them not being a part of the ride, like, or like getting to see that from my perspective was fascinating, heart-wrenching, to be like, "Oh man, that guy is responsible for this, this, and this, and he didn't even get to go on the rest of the ride. Like they dropped him at Star Wars. That's awful." That. But for them, I mean, the emotions must have been palpable. And yeah, like you were saying, Josh, like some of those things no one saw. Like not some of those things. I bet you most of those people didn't even know that that footage of them even existed. So seeing that part of themselves, like 30, 40 some
40.
odd year
Yeah.
later, like that's powerful. That's awesome.
It's always a surprise when you find someone had a camera rolling, You're like, oh, all
Yeah.
right.
I'm wondering if there was any particular story or any particular anecdote or a bit of information that surprised you the most that, maybe you didn't know about
Yeah. I
prior
was
to
kind of
watching.
alluding. I can't remember his name, but he was in charge of the special.
John Dykstra.
Yes. So I didn't know about John Dykstra. I didn't know what had happened after. I didn't know that he and George had been at odds. Except for, I mean, I had known that there was friction when Lucas came back from the shoot, but I didn't know that it had like it almost come to blows to some extent. And I also didn't hear, like, as they were moving forward, that Dykstra was like, "Hey, you're out." Like, and we're not even going to tell you that you're out. You're just out.
Well, so what's also kind of interesting about that specifically was that, so to back up for a sec, there was, coincidentally or not, I tend to think not, because there are too many coincidences. But shortly after Light and Magic was released, I think at the end of June, in July, the Vice channel, they also put out a 6-part documentary about the making of Star Wars that was sort of like, for me, it was like hard not to see it as like intentional counter programming to the Disney Plus Light and Magic series, because it's notable for including the first on-camera video interview with Marsha Lucas since I think maybe like ever. Like I know that, like, but since their divorce and like since 1983, she um has been sort of quiet and pretty absent. She doesn't, until recently, hasn't really spoken much about Star Wars at all. And what's interesting is that like I have some issues with how the Vice series, like, it's very clearly that they had a specific narrative that they were like they were essentially saying like George Lucas isn't the genius that his reputation would suggest, and like here are all the reasons uh, why, sort of, essentially. um but one thing that was interesting was that they interviewed a lot of the same people. And in the Vice documentary, John Dykstra says that um, he, it's true, he wasn't invited up to San Francisco, but that the reason was he had started his own company and had taken another job, which was doing the effects for Battlestar Galactica.
Hmm.
There was a very famous lawsuit between 20th Century Fox and Universal, and George Lucas was very angry because like the money he spent to fund the development of this technology, and like he got all of this in motion, and they're basically doing for another show what they were doing for him. And I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen the original Battlestar Galactica, but those fighters and those things, like, for a layman, yeah, like I could see like, oh, like here's like a Star Wars show, right?
They look damn
Yeah.
good. They look damn
Yeah.
good for
No,
TV.
no, they look really good. So I think it's a little more complicated. So it was interesting that he would say that, or they would include Dykstra saying that he left because he took another job, and that created some animosity. I mean, like the idea that ILM wasn't really ILM when they were making Star Wars. And then it sort of like forked off into two directions where George Lucas was like, okay, I need this to be a company. And if I'm going to make all these guys wait around for years in between movies, I need to set them up so that it's a business. But I
Yeah.
want to set it up here in San Francisco. So there was sort of like a split where you had the original gang and facility or whatever, and then they started over again in San Francisco with a lot of the same people. Like, I mean, they went up there because, I mean, who wouldn't, unless you had a reason not to or you weren't invited back. But but I thought that was a really interesting thing, that it wasn't until after Star Wars that ILM really, the decision to make it a company that did work beyond Star Wars, that transition happened in that moment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, I loved hearing about that, seeing how it all kind of formed, split, and also just like how many people that came out of that, like they affected, like they're responsible for all the movies and all the things that I cared about growing up. Like when I was like, wait, the maker of The Rocketeer was part of this original crew? Like I was like, that movie shaped me in ways I can't even comfortably talk about. And and I just to see that it's just like so many people. This whole group is just responsible for all the things that I gravitated towards as a kid, apart from maybe Goonies. Like, like I don't know, like, but I'm pretty sure they had a hand in Goonies at some point.
No, yeah, I think ILM
Yeah,
did the effects for Goonies. Yeah.
yeah, well, then there you go. Oh, yeah, because they were talking about working on the octopus or something like that.
I could riff on that directly where, yeah, I feel very similar about the Rockets here. But Joe Johnson, like, he was talking about, like, this moment when he was tasked with redesigning the Millennium Falcon because
Yeah,
Space
dude.
1999 had a ship that was very similar to the Blockade Runner. So, well, that was the Falcon at the time. They made the Falcon the
Mhm.
Blockade Runner, and he's like, "All right, I have to redesign a ship." And he's in his kitchen looking at dirty dishes and looking at saucers and like, what if I make the saucer actually directional and give it some, forward kind of a forward direction and engines in the back, and talking about designing it and making, I think 5 designs or so, and one had this right hand cockpit that he knew was kind of different, out of the ordinary. He knew that's what George was going to pick, and it's so funny to me that here you have Joe Johnson who is redesigning these ships and doing concept art, and I believe later George Lucas paid for him to go back to school.
Yeah.
They talk about so he could study directing, and I was just thinking like that's amazing to me, like that um, kind of paying it forward and just kind of keeping that community and growing it, and basically allowing. Later, he went on to do like Honey I Shrunk the Kids, like just probably one of my favorite directors because knowing so well how the FX is constructed to build story around that and integrate it in a way that's almost seamless. Definitely one of my standout. Um, like favorite parts of at least the first episode, and kind of seeing how these different people kind of each they kind of, I like that they get their spotlight moments in the show where they kind of talk about
Yeah.
specific instances and things. It kind of gives you some kind of more insight into how everyone was doing a little bit of everything. Really, truly was a jack of all trades in in that space. Just and it's kind of exciting to just see like uh, these guys who really had limited experience maybe in movies or this area just kind of took to it and learned and evolved, and you really, they talk about their growth, and that to me is always exciting to hear someone kind of growing into their role or taking on something new they've never done before, and in a space where everyone's helping you learn and kind of grow in that way.
It was fertile ground. Like that was some really, it was like such a fertile area for these minds to grow and learn and change and completely change the way things were done, which is I mean, you gave a great example of the stories that they were sharing with the plate. And what I loved about the show is that like within those spotlights they were able to like dig into these little like, yeah, we had to do this thing and it never been done before. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna try it. Uh, and then we did it.
Something you guys have both touched on that really struck me is that I think at some point, basically every one of them, I think, said something to the effect of, like, if it wasn't for this, like, I don't know what job I could have had, right? Like these specific combinations of skills, these jobs that they made careers out of, they didn't really exist. And the idea that they were just obviously very talented, but also in the right place at the right time, that idea that you can get into visual effects as a career really started then. Like before that, it was just like a hobby or something that you did on the side while you fixed, cars or something.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that, there's a point, I can't remember which episode, but basically, like Pixar was developing at ILM, and they're like, "This is not the direction we really want to go. We're going to sell it and focus on how these effects apply directly to movie making, that's live action." And I thought that was really interesting because I hadn't really understood that kind of division where they're like, yeah, it's better to let that grow somewhere else, and then you see them kind of working on. I think what was the first was the water creature from Abyss was kind of the first, or Young Sherlock Holmes, or the Young Sherlock Holmes plate glass stained glass window. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then also that CG sequence in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Yes, yes, yes. The Genesis planet. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was something else that was really crazy. Like I hadn't realized that. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. But the guy who was like the computer scientist who was like, you can make images with a computer. We can make a movie inside the computer. Like he had this like realization, like all the way back in something Catmull. I forget his name, but the idea that George Lucas essentially he underwrote the R&D for this entire field of study and development of this experimental technology, knowing that they wouldn't have anything to show for it for years and years and years, just because he just knew that this was where the future was on some.
Edwin Catmull.
Yes. So Ed Catmull, it's not just that ILM was the first one to apply these tools. They were also ground zero for this like genuine computing revolution. Like, something that I thought was really, enlightening when Ron Howard was talking about on Willow how they were trying to explain to him that they could create the morphing shot like all in one shot, and how they were like trying to explain to him it's like not a dissolve, it's like we do it all in the computer and blah blah blah, and how Ron Howard said that like he couldn't really wrap his head around what they were talking about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The morphing
Like,
scene from Willow, yeah.
yeah, but like that's something that I can relate to, that sense of like I hear what you're saying is going to happen, but I still don't have any real grasp of what it is you're trying to say to me. Like I literally don't have the conceptual framework. So that I thought was really fascinating. And even for Dennis Muren himself, like if it weren't for the particular way that Dennis Muren's mind works, this whole transition from practical effects to embracing digital technology, I don't know that it ever would have happened.
Or not then.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because like he just somehow was the only other one who saw the potential, who was like, you know what? I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to study computers because there's something here. I know that this is the way forward, but I need to figure out. He needed to get that conceptual framework so that
Mm.
he could move things there. And like that is pretty extraordinary. Like it's not, you think that these things are sort of inevitable, but the idea that it wasn't inevitable at that moment, certainly, but that it was really the understanding and the vision of these few individuals who took a chance, and they weren't really sure where the road they were going down was going to lead them, but they just had a feeling that that was the right road to go down, you
Yeah,
know?
I was fascinated about this part, for also just kind of like selfish reasons, because knowing that Ken Perlin, the creator of Perlin Noise, he had received his Academy Award for his part to play in that whole situation of like making the dinosaurs look realistic, because he was able to write an algorithm that allowed natural looking things to happen on the computer. So I was really looking forward to this transition, because I had known from his side that he was involved in that, only to find out that he wasn't written into the story. Like, he wasn't a part of the way that they were portraying that story, which I thought was interesting. Also, it's just like, man, I'm loving this, but also like after seeing that, like realizing that one part, it's like, oh wow, we're still missing a lot of the story. Like we're still missing a lot of what's going on. And that made me a little disheartened, but I kind of also understand, like you've got only you have to keep the focus. You got to keep the focus on it. Like it's not going to be just like story sprawling everywhere.
Yeah, well, because like this is still the story of industrial light and magic. Like, I mean, yeah, like there are so many things where I was like, I want a whole episode on like just that sentence you just said.
Yeah.
Can we make another season where like we go through it all again, but from the perspective of some other people?
You saying that, I really do think it is like one of the most significant parts of movie history that I care about. Um, Probably because, having grown up being shaped by it, it's like, all right, let me go find out how I was invented. Like, let me go
Yeah.
see like
Yeah. Yes.
how my mind got built by this thing. Some of the things, like there is definitely like in Industrial Lights and Magic, like how it was formed. A lot of the framework in the early episodes really is like the George Lucas story, because they're talking about American Graffiti, and they're talking about these hot rods, and they transition into talking about designing the tie and the X-wing, and how the rebels were basically hot rodders, like getting old beat up, using patchwork to rebuild these starships, and hot rodding the engines. And the Imperials have like off the assembly line stuff, and there's this kind of hot rodding nature, and a lot of that kind of detail is really what I always liked about Star Wars. There was this element of like intricate detail, like there's so many design elements and so much, like I think a young brain, or particularly my young brain, was like very drawn to really like finesse details, and like the technology, like how the technology looked, how it played. And I kind of like that, like the rebel spirit, that kind of hot rodding, like we're up against everything. And that kind of, they're kind of working the story of the Star Wars idea back into the episode. I really appreciate that, because I feel like that's a very Kasdan, possibly, influence to really shape. Let's give some backbone to uh, this documentary by really connecting it back and forth between the movie philosophy, the industrial philosophy, the influence philosophy, and that kind of very very interesting flow back and forth between narrative story and construction of the show itself. I thought was really kind of brilliant and seamless, and excited me because it kept on reminding me of, these are the things that I really like about it, that kind of will always make Star Wars special. And I feel like maybe that's something that got a little bit lost along the way. That kind of, that roughness, that tactility, like where do these come from? The philosophies of designing these ships. I think, the used universe always got carried through, but a lot of the other kind of philosophies, maybe, I'm sure they were still there, but very noticeable here in the early Star Wars, at the start of it. And I just love the idea of, like, we're gonna soup up these engines. Like, it's exciting. Like, the idea of their ships are exciting. It's exciting on many levels, a lot of layers of excitement. That's kind of what shows through here. And they are using that early on, the George Lucas life narrative, to kind of shape a lot of the philosophy of why they constructed the way that they did these things. So that was kind of a fun little um, way to look at it, a little framework device.
I
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting, right? George Lucas created this company because he wanted to create Star Wars. And, one of the interesting things I think people separate when they talk about George Lucas and Star Wars, like there's a line of thinking saying that for him it became like too much about the effects and not enough about the movie or the story. And I think for him, it seems like it's all one thing. It's like I can't make the movie without these tools, and I want these tools so I can make this movie. Like he starts with the pre-production, and the design sort of feed the script, and the script only sort of exists out of necessity so that everyone knows what it is that we're talking about, because even from then he gets all of the pieces, and then through the editing process he sort of like changes it again. He's like, okay, so now I see this, and now he's sort of like, sculpting it out of clay. And I think that act of creation, I think, is not separate for him from the end product. It's not that he's so enamored of technology and effects. It's like that's what it all is for him, right? It's one thing.
yeah.
It's like that
Does that
Marshall
make sense?
McLuhan, the medium is the message, like kind
Yeah.
of, like it really, they're one and the same. Like movie making, the narrative in the movie, it doesn't make a difference to him. It's really the same thing in his mind. He's making the same thing no matter what the focus is.
Yeah, it's like I want to play with these toys, but I can't do it without making a movie. And the whole reason I want to play with these is because I want to make a movie, right? It's sort of like it's not one or the other. It's like, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt a kinship kind of with George Lucas increasingly watching this, but also I realized more and more I didn't want that. Like I realized it's like I I actually, the more I'm hearing about you, dude, I don't want to be anything like you, but I'm realizing I'm way too much like there's a lot of similarities in the way that I felt like I thought and how I approached things, and I was like, oh man, this isn't good. Like it's like this mirror is too
Well,
a little too reflective,
so
a
let
little too
so
clean.
so let's talk about that. Did this change or at least inform your thoughts and feelings about George Lucas himself, either positive or negative.
Yes, yes. It definitely changed the way I saw him and informed me as to how he operated. I don't think that that's necessary. I don't think less of him. I've always thought he was a human, but it was seeing what he was trying to do. He understood the fundamentals. Like, this is possible. Like, I know that we can do these things because the elements are there. Um, uh, 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 I I just need somebody who is gonna put in the effort to bring these elements together. And so he's always working from that perspective of, this is possible. I know this element has been done before, and I know this other element has been done before. I'm just asking to do them together. That's all I'm asking you to do. But the thing is, everybody else around him, uh, uh, they don't understand that those two things can go together, even though they have been done before. Like, they don't see how those elements go together, and uh, he wasn't necessarily a great communicator. He would just be like, just give it a thought, like, like, try it out. Um, I thought that was kind of fascinating. I thought it was fascinating. He wasn't a great communicator. He was just like, he had the money and he had the time and the opportunity to give others to just like make a go of something.
I feel like his hands were tied in a way where he couldn't if he could execute his story by himself alone, he would have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He if he needing other people was detrimental to his process. Um, but and I wouldn't even call him a manager of people because he wasn't even good at that. He needed people to be the managers. He was a man who had ideas and could build and basically he set up ILM. He built the company and populated it with other people to figure out the rest of the company. Like he's like, I can get this one guy. He will find the others. Really, he had hope, a lot of faith in other. He did have a lot of faith in other people. This is the most skilled person I could find to do this. I and putting trust in people because he really had no other option. I don't think I don't know if a lot of it was foresight or just, well, I have no other option. I hope this works and
Hmm.
getting really lucky. And there's a certain level of skill to still choosing these people, and you're producing a picture. You're putting all these elements together. I think ILM happens to be a magnificent happenstance of people, like a once in a lifetime situation. Um, did it change how I feel about George Lucas? No, because you still need that person, the driving force with the vision. You still need someone to get angry when something doesn't go their way. You need that you need that pressure out there. Like, George is coming back from the UK, and he's not happy. Like, you still need that person has to be there. There has to be like a driving vision, even if that's not the person physically executing the tasks. Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah.
An author of the piece, but not
Hmm.
necessarily the person holding the pen.
Yeah, to borrow a line from Aaron Sorkin's Steve Jobs movie, he's like, he conducts the orchestra.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, he's the conductor of the orchestra, but even though he's not playing any of the individual instruments. I thought it was pretty funny when he said he doesn't even know how to really use a computer.
Yeah.
He just knows what they can do. Um, which I gotta say kind of surprised me a little bit because you would
Mm.
think that a guy who since the 70s was investing this much into the R&D for developing digital technology that like he just over time and through proximity he would have picked up a few things, but if you take what he says at face value, he's just like yeah, like I don't even know how to work my phone. I
I
mean,
can totally feel that. Like, to me, I was like, I really sunk with that because, like, when you work with people who are like really into their shit, like working with somebody who really knows their machine learning programs and the algorithms and like networking and how to set up all this shit, and like it does these amazing things, and all I care about is like, oh, so I can do this, this, and this now.
Cool.
I don't feel the desire to go learn the ins and outs of how those particular things work. And but I do love the idea that I could have a facility and facilitate that capability with others and work with others and bring those minds, so I could just be like, yeah, yeah, totally do that thing. Now, while you're doing that thing, just pump out this thing too. Like, I want this thing out of that. And I don't want to learn. I just want that thing.
He
It
he,
kind of
he
reminds
knew.
me.
I was gonna say he knew what he didn't know.
Yeah.
So something my partner, I'm saying my partner expressed. I actually sat her down and made her rewatch the show with me because like I thought like after I watched it, I realized how this stuff that they were talking about was so in my DNA. I was like, I really want you to see this. I'm not sure why, but I feel like you will have a greater understanding of where I came from. It's like what you said, Russ. I forget exactly how you put it, but you said something like, "I want to know how I was invented" or something. Like I wanted to know. Like I was like, "So let me see what she gets out of this." And like she enjoyed it. She thought it was interesting. She loved Phil Tippett, which we could talk
Phil
about.
Tippett.
I don't know,
Yeah.
which we'll get into. But one of the things that I thought was really striking was she said, George Lucas seems kind of lame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because from her perspective, like, there's this great human story that's there. And to the documentary's credit, they don't shy away from this, but that transition from physical effects to digital technology had a very human cost. And, like I'm not going to sit here and say that they shouldn't have made the advances or the choices that they made, but there was that sense of camaraderie, that sense of magic that's still there, but it's a different kind of magic. It's sort of like now magic in terms of they can create and do things that you can't explain. So it's like, it seems like magic, right? But like the loss of that, Russ, like you were saying, that tactile sort of like human side of it, I think was what she was responding to. And I agree with you. I do think it's there from the beginning. I think that George Lucas would have made these movies all by himself if he could have. I think that he created this whole company as a means to an end. And I think that, that camaraderie, that magic was incidental to what he was trying to do, what he was in it for.
I just want to touch on the Phil Tippett thing, because I think in the series here, Spielberg's like, I wanted the best guy to do my dinosaurs, and he's like hired Phil Tippett, and who had started to do these claymation velociraptors, I think, as an early test, and the footage. I think they have some of that footage that they show, and ultimately that transition to mostly digital for the Raptors, like basically, for those that haven't seen it, they went a different direction. And so here's Phil Tippett, who had a job lined up and now no longer is doing the main, Velociraptor effect work. They hired him to be the FX supervisor for the show, for Jurassic Park. So using what he knows, able to craft and hone the CG to have weight and to move in ways. And he's basically kind of like the dinosaur puppeteer in a way, even though it was digital. So still kind of using what he knows to impart, and basically, I think why some of that Jurassic Park digital looks better than almost any other digital or
Yeah.
CGI coming out, because he's basically using it as a puppet and still using those learned skills. And it holds up. It has weight in ways that other CGI doing the exact same thing these days does not, because I think there's maybe some sort of disconnect with the person who knows the tactility, foot on the ground, what it actually looks like.
Yeah, yeah, he had kind of internalized the sense of physics
Yeah.
and anatomy and how things should move, and I think, uh, why I feel like, uh, George was amazing in ways that I didn't know, like, creating paths for people to grow as Industrial Light and Magic grew and changed, but then also like for not seeing that these moments were about to happen, like for not being there or setting up something for the people that have brought him to where he is, and like that transition that that it would just like you would let something like that land on Phil, like this, like land, like I know that's not necessarily fully George's responsibility at that juncture of Industrial Light and Magic's journey, right? Like he probably wasn't even necessarily around for that. It was kind of completely up to Spielberg at that point and stuff like that. But I just feel like that was a great way of kind of forecasting what was about to happen with the entire, like hearing the stories of people being like, hey, the character shop's really starting to dwindle down here, but and like we don't want to talk to those people who are going over to CG, and then I can't remember the name of the artist, but she was like, I think I'm gonna go learn the CG thing, and other people kind of like poo-pooing that decision. Like that felt like the team needed a little bit more care than I think at that time George maybe had the faculty to give.
That was
Well,
Gene Bolt, who went over
yeah.
to
Okay,
CG.
she was cool.
The other thing, it's not just the care, it's also that ILM transformed into something like it became a big company, right?
Mm,
Like there's the possibility, the likelihood even that he knew the names of everyone who worked at Industrial Light and Magic on Star Wars. I doubt he knew the names of everyone who worked at Industrial Light and Magic in 1993.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. And to the doc's credit, they get into how tumultuous and not straightforwardly good a thing that moment was. Phil Tippett, who I think we all remember seeing, moving the AT-ATs from behind the scenes stuff as a kid and moving the Rancor in Return of the Jedi and behind the scenes stuff, like this guy who I don't think it's inaccurate to say is like a childhood hero in some way, I think, to all three of us. I was taken aback by some of his frankness in this interview. Like, he has a line where, like, he was talking about how people ask him, like, as a stop motion animator, like, don't you ever get sick of it? Like, it's so tedious and blah, blah, blah. And, like, he's talking about it, and he's now realized that he has certain mental health challenges that, like, the stop motion was sort of his Zen place, and he said something. I think the gist of it was if it weren't for finding that, he probably would have killed himself.
yeah,
Which I was like, that really hit me. And it sounds really silly to say, like, I don't know him, I've never met him, but like it really hit me in an emotional place because I feel like I know who this guy is. If that makes any sense.
yeah. No, I totally. I felt for him, and especially I felt this amazing spark of joy when I was telling my wife about something about Phil Tippett, and I think it might have even been exactly what you just pointed out, like this moment of realization that like if I didn't have this, I would have killed myself. Like him coming to terms like that he had certain mental conditions that like now could be identified that back then he was just dealing with shit. Um, and me saying his name and my oldest daughter being like, "Oh yeah, I remember him." And I was like, "You don't remember Phil Tippett?" And she was like, "No, he's the dude who did the Rancor." And I was like, "That's amazing!"
That is
I
amazing.
rewatched that first episode, and you remember that? I was beaming with pride.
That is
So
amazing.
it was fantastic.
Speaking of Bracey, so for me, Phil Tippett, so there was him, and then there was also the couple who met in the model shop and then got married, and the two of them transitioned and went over to the dark side and did all the CG stuff and stayed at ILM. That couple and Phil Tippett, I think, represent like the human cost of what that transition actually was. And
Mhm.
I think Lawrence Kasdan's sympathies are kind of with them a little bit because the very final story in the final episode is, and Bracey, I'm sure this affected you as much as it affected me, but the final moment of the whole show is Phil Tippett recalling an anecdote about coming home and his daughter was crying, and he was like, "What's the matter?" And she's like, "I'm too old for my toys." And how Phil Tippett was like, he looked at her and he went, "If you make movies, you never have to grow up and you never have to stop playing with toys." And it was right then they grabbed a camera and they grabbed some of her toys and they went outside. And that's how the whole documentary ends. So, I mean, not only is that just like an amazingly beautiful, lovely anecdote, but that's also what they leave you with, which I think speaks volumes.
Yeah, and now, what remains, like, it's interesting because, like, while that heart is gone, there is still something very special about Industrial Light and Magic and what they're capable of producing in a world where, like, the tools have become, more evenly distributed.
Yeah.
And the
Hmm.
mindsets
Hmm.
and the processes. But I have, over the last a decade, as I've been switching over out of the film industry into the VR industry. Something that I've noticed, even watching behind the scenes information on virtual reality experiences that were built by the Industrial Light and Magic team, when you dive into what they did, you see that the level of detail and craftiness that they are able to put into their experiences still is leading them to results that are beating out everybody else in the industry, regardless of the amount of money that somebody is dumping into a project. So there is still that magic there that has kind of
Yeah.
lived on, even despite the loss of a lot of the humanity that we're kind of we're speaking to.
No, completely. Like they are still the gold standard, and there is something that retained. There is still kind of a spark there that I don't think you see everywhere else, or at least certainly not in the same quantity.
Mhm.
Um,
There's a pedigree there, you know.
yeah, like let's talk about John Knoll for a second. Like, I mean, this guy, he's like a savant. He invented Photoshop. Like
Yeah.
I mean, like, like, that's crazy. He's the one when they were recruiting for ILM, he, for his senior project, had constructed his own motion control rig, like, in his dorm room. So, like, he basically he built a the equivalent of the Dijkstraflex in his dorm room in college. And and then what's even crazier is they bring this all full circle at the end when on The Mandalorian, which is utilizing the volume technology and the Unreal Engine to create all of these incredible shots and environments in real time. They really wanted to do something old school, and they went and they got that couple from the model shop and they built a physical model. And John Knoll, who apparently can build a motion control rig in his sleep, he started to build a motion control rig, and they recreated this way of doing things for these few shots in The Mandalorian, like just out of the fact that John Knoll has the know-how to be able to do that, to straddle the line between the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things in a way that allows it to live on. And they were talking about how, like, yeah, like he was, they were building a model and he built this motion control rig from scratch, and how people at ILM were coming out of their cubicles or whatever and were like standing around and were like, what is going on? Like, this is the coolest shit ever. Like, it's there is something still there. It's like I feel like that could only happen at Industrial Light and Magic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the magic's still there. They still got the magic. That's what we've learned.
Russ, you said something interesting about like how the CG in Jurassic Park holds up, um, and is uh, better than some CG effects in movies that come out today. I think one of the um, um, I mean, in addition to just the raw talent of the people who were working on it, I think that some of the other factors in play, because of the digital revolution that was augured in by ILM and Jurassic Park, there's this over reliance and a misunderstanding of what CG is good for. And I think that because it's sort of a mystery to most people, there's this perception that, like, you can just do anything. Like, there's no planning and there's no understanding of what's required and what the technology is capable of and what its limitations are. So you just have these undisciplined CG fests that end up not being so meticulously designed and constructed, and sort of like, one of the things about Jurassic Park is also the way that it's not just CG. It's like a blend of all of these techniques, and all of them are the A team. So it's like knowing when to use CG versus when to use something practical. And I don't think that a lot of shows now have the luxury or even the knowledge to know, like, oh, like, we shouldn't do this CG because it's actually not the most effective way to do it, sort of thing. It seems to me. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they kind of take it for granted. Yeah.
Yeah, they take it for granted. They don't see that there's like an artistry to the way to use these tools, and that you don't use. I mean, like CG, even though you don't necessarily need to know how to use lenses. If you don't know how this stuff meshes all together. And like, why would you change focal length even in a CG context? It's like you don't understand the how light works, how physics works. Like you just you're just kind of like pointing a camera at something and assuming that it's going to capture the magic, and in fact how you use the tools goes a long way to showing how much magic you do catch.
No, and there's actually a great video on YouTube, the channel, the Royal Ocean Film Society, like last week or the week before, he released a video called "The Visual Effects Crisis." It gets into a lot of these issues, and I think is sort of eye-opening. Like, I think one of the things about ILM that people don't realize is that they are the creme de la creme, and like most VFX houses don't have the resources or are given the respect to be listened to. There's an expectation of magic, but not understanding how to provide the resources in order for that magic to be created, if that makes any sense.
It does.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, Final question. Who do you think is the MVP of Industrial Light and Magic? Not necessarily to the exclusion of anybody else, because everyone in this was unique and amazing. But is there someone who stands out who's like, yeah, they're my guy, or they like Star Wars or the film industry wouldn't be what it is without this person?
I forgot their name, but she mentioned that she had answered some kind of ad in a classified and she had shown up, and she's basically responsible for how they organized their shots and how they started to pull their things together. I feel
Oh
like
yeah, Rose.
that
I think
uh,
Rose
yeah,
Rose
she's an
Dugan.
unsung hero in a way that like it is like it's easy for, especially I think from my side, to like really get fixated on the VFX and like on the creative side. But somebody who was able to walk into that and be like, "All right, y'all are amazing, but you need this. Like you need to organize how you're doing all this stuff." I don't think ILM would be ILM or Star Wars would be Star Wars if that that energy didn't enter when it did, and start to like yeah align these special powers together.
That's a good answer.
I can't top that.
Yeah. No, I don't think I don't think either of us could top that.
I'm
Good night.
sorry. I'm sorry.
I guess what I'd say is, like, I went in knowing a lot about Phil Tippett, and I think I didn't know as much about Dennis Muren, and I feel like Dennis Muren really played a role, and we'd already kind of talked about shaping that transition, and I really feel like that he was the right person at the right time, and to me, in my
Mhm.
eyes, he really stood out for me as a really an MVP in kind of the history narrative of ILM, for sure. Personally, Joe Johnson, learning more about him and kind of what he did. Like, I just he's kind of like the his creative story to directing. It's just fantastic. I like everything that he puts out, and I like his way of thinking.
No, that's another good answer. I don't know who who I was going to say. I think maybe I would also go with Dennis Muren, but since you mentioned him, I gotta go with Phil Tippett.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not to say that his contribution wasn't invaluable, but I think more for me, like he represents that like heart and humanity. Again, not to the exclusion of anyone else, but just because of his particular story, I think I left watching the series emotionally most impacted by his story in kind of a visceral way.
Yeah, the great thing about that question is, in this crowd, it's really hard to make a bad choice.
You
No,
can't go
yeah. No,
wrong.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, no, I mean, you can make a case for anybody. Like, we didn't even mention, Richard Edlund and Ken Ralston. Like, Richard Edlund like was in the Navy, and then like was like a cable car conductor, and like that was like another thing that not only did they create jobs that never really existed, but you don't hear about people with career trajectories like that anymore. Like, I don't think it was ever really possible at any other time in American history except for like the mid 20th century to not really know what you wanted to do and be able to survive just by changing careers every couple of years and just like, yeah, I'll drive a cable car for a while and I'll shuck oysters and I'll oh hey, I'm the founder of the most influential visual effects house in the entire history of cinema. Wow, that's crazy. It's just like I feel like that stuff doesn't really happen that same way anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, I think we pretty much covered it, right?
Yep.
I'm really glad you guys in particular I knew would be affected similarly to the impact that this series had on me. So I'm really glad both of you were able to join in this discussion, this docu-series. Light and Magic is available to stream now on Disney Plus. We are Trash Compactor. Please visit Trash Pod for transcripts of this episode and all our other episodes. And we are Trash Pod across all social media. And we will see you on the next one.